Hello, this video is about reductionism. In particular, of course, reductionism in science, as discussed within the literature on philosophy of science. So you might have heard somebody say that we're nothing but atoms, right? That especially when they're talking about one of our uh, worries and our emotions and maybe thinking about the meaning of life or something. Somebody might say, oh, none of that's real. None of that actually matters because all we are is just atoms swirling around and interacting in space. That's kind of an informal, rough and ready way of describing reductionism. And so the idea here is that some phenomenon, some what we might say higher level phenomenon that we observe in the world can be explained in terms of its underlying parts. And this is an extremely common thing that goes on in science, right? We take something that's some complicated system that we want to understand, but it's just too complicated to look at it all at once. So we break it down into its individual bits and pieces, find out what those bits and pieces are, find out how those bits and pieces are interacting with each other. And that way we can get a fuller understanding of what's actually happening. And we can provide a causal explanation of the causal mechanisms that are involved in that complicated system. Extremely common pattern that we see in scientific research. So when this happens, what we say is that this higher level system, this complicated thing that we're observing, is reduced to nothing more than its interacting pieces. And by doing that, that's how we gain a real scientific understanding and can provide a real scientific explanation in terms of the underlying causes and the underlying particles involved in that system. And some might say that this is the ultimate goal of science, is to reduce higher level complicated systems to their underlying bits and pieces to provide a full explanation, a full scientific explanation of what's really going on. So here's an example. Lightning, this extremely dramatic natural phenomenon that we don't have to go very far back in history to see people explaining lightning in terms of supernatural forces, or even if they believe it to be a purely natural phenomenon. It's one of these things that's like, well, we'll never really understand what that is. It's this complex, amazing, spectacular thing that's going on. Well, it turns out the more we looked into it, that we started to realize that this was electricity. Of course, we needed to first know what electricity was, needed to recognize the existence of electricity. But by the 1700s or so, scientists started to get an appreciation for this thing called electricity, and that lightning was really just an electrical phenomenon. Then, through the subsequent decades and centuries, we started to understand what electricity really is. It's actually charged particles, right? In particular, negatively charged electrons are responsible for what we call electricity. And when electrons are flowing from one place to another, that's electrical current. And lightning, this incredibly dramatic natural phenomenon, is actually nothing more than flowing electrons. Right? Electrons flowing from between cloud and Earth, or from cloud to cloud. So what's happened is we've reduced this very large and dramatic phenomenon to its underlying fundamental physics particles, right? The interaction and behavior of electrons. Another example, rainbows, another very dramatic natural phenomenon, also had been attributed to supernatural forces. But what we now know is that we can explain what rainbows are, why rainbows exist, and why rainbows are the way they are, just in terms of the underlying physics, right? It's photons of light of different wavelengths that interact with particles of water in the air in such a way that it refracts the photons, right, the rays of light in a particular way to separate the colors and make us see this rainbow effect, what we call a rainbow effect at the large scale. So this macroscopic large scale phenomenon has been reduced to explained in terms of nothing more than the underlying physics. Here's an example of something that is ongoing, definitely far from fully successful, but has also met with a huge amount of success, reducing life, right? Living organisms like birds and plants. Why do animals, right? Why do living organisms look the way they look? Why do they behave the way they behave? Why do they have the inputs and outputs that they have? Oh, well, it's because they're made up of cells. And we've learned a lot about why organisms are the way they are by understanding their cells and how the cells interact with each other. And are put together to build these large macroscopic systems that we call animals or plants or whatnot. So we can then go even further. When studying cells, it's like, well, why do cells do what they do? What are they made of? Well, we learn about the underlying molecular biology and the biochemistry that goes into making cells, the proteins and carbohydrates and lipids and so on that are put together in a particular way to make a cell what it is and make it do what the cell does, and why its inputs and outputs are what they are, how it does its metabolism, how it transforms energy and so on. So we gain a deep understanding into cellular biology by looking at molecular biology and biochemistry. So we've now reduced, so the idea goes, to a large extent, we've reduced this large, very complex system of an organism down to cells, and then further to biochemistry. And then further, we can explain the biochemistry just in terms of the underlying atoms that are involved. And then we can explain the atoms just in terms of the subatomic particles that are involved in those atoms. So ultimately, the goal here is that we can provide a full causal scientific explanation for living organisms just in terms of the underlying physical particles that make up those organisms. That would be a successful reduction of biology all the way to physics. So putting that sort of more in verbal terms here, right, on this slide, reductionism is this idea, this view, this hope that all things can be reduced to their constituent parts, with those constituent parts at the smallest level being quanta, right, being subatomic particles, quarks and electrons and whatnot. So everything that science would seek to explain can ultimately be explained just in terms of those underlying physics particles, which can in turn be explained by mathematical equations, perhaps, and geometry. So all things in the universe, right? Everything that can be scientifically explained can ultimately be explained in terms of mathematical equations from physics. And this includes really everything, everything that is studied by the so-called special sciences. That term special sciences is something that shows up in the philosophy of science literature, where it's sort of everything above physics and chemistry. These days, physics and chemistry are pretty indistinguishable, but biology, ecology, geology, astronomy, paleontology, psychology, sociology, those are all special sciences. And according to reductionists, they can all be reduced from this high-level, complicated stuff that's going on in the special sciences all the way down to understanding them just in terms of the underlying physics. And not only that, sort of the dramatic result of full reductionism would be that we can pretty much stop talking about the special sciences. We can stop talking about things that we normally talk about just in biology or sociology, psychology, astronomy, and whatnot. We can talk about them just in terms of physics. Everything that a scientist would want to know about in the special sciences can be accounted for through the most fundamental science, that is physics. So if we put that into this kind of argument form here, we would say that the first premise is that everything that exists is ultimately composed of fundamental particles, photons, electrons, quarks, and so on. All causation, according to physics, according to science, is ultimately accounted for by particle interactions, right? It's electromagnetic interactions, gravity, the strong and weak nuclear forces. This accounts for all causation in the universe. And a proper scientific explanation is a causal explanation. So therefore, a proper scientific explanation should always be in terms of the fundamental particles that are responsible for all of that causation. So if we want to really provide a full, proper scientific explanation for everything going on in the special sciences, we should work to reduce that all the way down to the fundamental physics. May take a long time, right? It may be just sort of an infinite ongoing exercise to make this happen, but the thought is that you ultimately can do it. There's sort of an endpoint to the reductionist project, that everything will be explained just in terms of the underlying physics. Here's another way of talking about reductionism and explaining what reductionism is doing. And this alternate explanation will become important, especially when we're talking about the potential problems associated with reductionism that I'll cover in a separate video. But in order to really understand this way of approaching reductionism, we need to first explain some terms here. There's this important distinction between a type and a token. This shows up in lots of places in the philosophy of science and in metaphysics. But a type is, as it says here, a category of thing. So electrons in general, right? That's a category of things that exist. Photons, a general category. There's many subcategories, right? Photons of different wavelengths and so on. But they're all photons. They all belong to this type, to this category. Similarly with atoms and cells, there's lots of different kinds of atoms, a lot of different kinds of cells. But atoms all belong to a particular category, right? Atoms. Same thing with cells. They're different. There's diverse kinds of cells, but they all belong to the same category, cell. Same thing with trees. There's lots of different kinds of stars, but stars are a certain type of thing that exists in the world. Now we contrast that with tokens. A token is a very specific individual instance of a type. So we could talk about atoms in general, or we could talk about one particular atom, a particular token atom. It might be that physicists have isolated one specific atom and they're trying to manipulate it in very particular ways. So that's a particular token of a type, right? A particular atom in this category. Or trees is a category. It's a type of thing that exists in the natural world. Or I could pick out one token of a tree. I could say that tree right there in the front yard, that's one token tree that belongs in the category of trees. Or stars, there's billions and billions and billions of stars in that category. They all belong to that type of thing. Or we could talk about one particular token star, the one that our planet orbits. Okay. Here's another distinction that can become relevant when talking about reductionism. A natural kind or a natural type versus an artificial kind or an artificial type. A natural kind or a natural type is a type of thing that exists in the world completely independently of humans and human interests. So we could say, if humans had never existed, this type of thing would still be around. Or way before humans existed, this type of thing was around. Certainly electrons, before there were any humans and before there were any chemists or physicists or anybody that had any notion of subatomic particles, electrons were still there, right? Electrons were there, they existed before humans ever came up with a word for them. Same thing with stars. Before there was even an Earth, there were stars around. So that is a natural kind of thing that exists in the natural world, completely independent of humans. We contrast that with artificial kinds, artificial types. So houses and books, these are things that are made by humans to serve human interests. They're not a thing that existed before humans existed or something that exists independent of humans. There might be other intelligent life in the universe, and they might produce something that looks like books, but that's their kind of thing. Our books, right, are strings of symbols that have meaning for other humans that we gather together in pages and bind together in these large volumes. Those are human-made things. And so that's an artificial type of thing. Money, that's a social construct, right? We've all agreed that we've got this stuff that we refer to as money that we can use in monetary interactions, right? To buy and sell stuff. That's purely human invention. That's not a natural kind of thing that would exist independent of humans. It is fundamentally dependent upon humans. So that is an artificial kind. Same thing with bachelors. That's a social category. It's not as if humans all disappeared, or if we go way back in time before humans existed, there were no bachelors, right? You need to have bachelors, you need to have something like marriage and monogamous relationships and so on, in order for there to be bachelors that are not involved in such relationships. So that's an artificial category, an artificial type. Okay, so each theory, each area of research in science is concerned with its own types of things, its own kinds, its own categories. Physicists are concerned with electrons and protons and photons and so on. Those are the types of things that physicists are concerned with. Geneticists are concerned with a different type of things. They might pay attention to protons, neutrons, electrons, and so on, but they're focused on genes and a type of biochemical, right? A molecular area from molecular biology of deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA and RNA. So they're concerned with those types of things. Astronomers are concerned with stars and maybe planets and some other kinds of things that are relevant to their area of science. So each theory in science is concerned with its own kinds of things. And reductionism is the project of reducing every type that exists in the special sciences down to types in physics, right? Taking things from a higher level theory and reducing them to a more fundamental theory. And the ultimate long-term goal of reductionism is to take all the types that exist in the universe and reduce them just to types in physics. That would be full, complete success in reductionism. And here's an example. It's considered to be a successful example of reductionism, where we've reduced, so the thinking goes, we've reduced water, this macroscopic phenomenon that we observe in the natural world, and we figured out what it really is. So the thinking goes, what it really is H2O molecules, right? So that's a type of molecule composed of oxygen atoms and hydrogen atoms. And we can understand water molecules just in terms of those atoms and their interactions with each other. So everything that we would want to know and scientifically understand and explain about water can be explained and understood just in terms of this reducing theory, right? That we reduce it down to just physics. And we might wonder, we can talk about this, is that reduction really complete? Is everything, especially everything that we want to scientifically know and understand about water, really captured in terms just of physics and the underlying particles? Maybe. This one, much more complicated one. And as I said earlier, this is an ongoing project. Take this biological type, animals, or just organism, perhaps, and we reduce it, right? Go through a couple of steps, but ultimately the project is to reduce it down to just atoms so that our scientific understanding and explanation for organisms can be done just in terms of physics types, protons, neutrons, electrons, and so on. And here, this is an even more dramatic question. Is that reduction really complete? Is everything that we know scientifically and can explain and understand and want to understand and know about organisms really captured just by the physics of atoms? Maybe, but maybe not. If reductionism is really successful, then what it's doing is it's kind of eliminating the special sciences, right? It's explaining away the things that are happening at that higher level. This goes back to that kind of informal phrasing that we used at the very beginning of saying, oh, none of that stuff, our emotions and hopes and dreams and meaning of life and all of that, none of that's real. It can all just be explained in terms of fundamental particles whizzing around in these complex patterns in otherwise empty space. So physics can explain away these things that are happening at these higher levels, and we can stop using the terminology that we use in biology and psychology and sociology and economics and so on. Stop using all of those terms, stop using all of those types and categories and so on, and just explain everything in terms of physics. There are people that push back against this, and I'll explain this more fully in a different video, but some people might suggest that not everything can be reduced in this way, right? When we go through that project of reduction from a higher level theory in the special sciences down to physics, that we lose something important, that our scientific understanding of those things is diminished. We lose something scientifically important. It could be perhaps that there are some things that are just independent of physics. Maybe even there are non-physical things that exist. Now, that's not a popular view in the sciences, certainly, and in lots of philosophy of science. Sometimes it's thought of as maybe relying on religious ideas or the supernatural or magic somehow. But there could be some things that are non-religious and sort of non-magical that are still non-physical. Then even sticking with just purely physical things, some people might suggest, as we'll talk about in another video, that we are losing some of our scientific understanding when we reduce all the way down to physics. If we're just talking about fundamental particles, we're losing some of the context that exists, some of the important causal context that exists at those higher levels that's important for our scientific understanding. So if that's the case, then reductionism might give us some really interesting insights into what's going on in the special sciences, but it's not going to completely replace our understanding of what's going on in the special sciences. That the reductionist project will never be fully complete. So this thinking goes. Thank you.